Hey, everybody. I'm Professor Bobby Chesney of the University of Texas at Austin. I'm the director of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law. With me today is Professor Matt Waxman of Columbia University, who directs Columbia's National Security Law program. UT and Columbia have teamed up to curate a series of lectures on national security law that cover a growing array of topics. Our hope is that these will be useful to people in general, but especially to students. There's an introductory lecture that surveys the scope of the field. And then there's a growing series of lectures on various other topics. For example, we have some from me covering covert action, cybersecurity, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And now we're in the midst of a 3-lecture series from Matt on the Constitution and war powers. We're about to begin the second lecture in that sequence. We're going to go for about an hour and a half, and then we're going to break before reassembling to record the 3rd war powers lecture. Feel free to post questions using the Q&A function along the way, and if possible, we'll try to get to those. We can't promise we will, but we will if time makes it possible. I know that Matt's going to provide some orientation that will connect how we're starting off in this lecture on the initiation or resort to war to the prior lecture and how it all fits together in a 3-lecture series. So without further ado, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Matt Waxman from Columbia.
Thanks very much, Bobby. Thank you, Bobby, and thanks to the Strauss Center for hosting me. I'm excited about these lectures and about the series project generally. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Great, you've got my slides. Great. So today we're talking about constitutional war powers and the question of initiating force or initiating war. As Bobby said, this is the second of 3 lectures. The first one was on foundations of this topic, including a close reading of the constitutional text and discussion of debates at the founding about war powers. This lecture is about the Constitution and decisions to go to war or to initiate military intervention. And I want to emphasize 3 points throughout it. One is the growth in American power. And I want to make the point that growth in American power comes about from the beginning. You see a steady chipping away at formal congressional control over war initiation or force initiation decisions. Happens from the beginning. Second point I want to emphasize is that all 3 branches are responsible for this. It's not just that the president is aggrandizing his office. The other branches have played a role too. Partly, Congress is giving away some power in this area. There are some structural reasons for that and some political reasons why Congress doesn't always want responsibility for this issue. The last issue I want to discuss is this a problem or is this a crisis? This is often talked about as perhaps the most important war powers issue. Who gets to decide whether we initiate war or initiate force? I actually disagree with that view. Historically, I don't think it's the most consequential war powers question. And I think sometimes focusing too much on war initiation diverts attention from Congress's other powers, including legislating and overseeing how wars are waged. And those are going to be subjects of the next lecture, lecture 3. So some of the first, as just a quick review, some of the first lecture's main themes included the following, that the Constitution provides for and controls military power and war in many interlocking ways, but it also contains a lot of ambiguities and gaps, and disputes about those ambiguities and gaps emerge almost immediately after the nation is founded, and they tend to be addressed through practice among the political branches in managing real-world crises. I talked the last time about how there's actually a lot of text. This is just some of the constitutional text. Don't strain your eyes. I'll blow some of it up. This is just some, and I'll just highlight a few aspects. A lot of emphasis, obviously, in this lecture on Congress's power in Article 1 to declare war. There's lots of debate about what this this phrase, this clause means. In my view, the evidence is very strong that the founders intended the Constitution to grant Congress exclusive power to take the nation from peace to full-blown war. Many founders thought that lodging that power in Congress would help restrain presidential impulses towards war. But now, although the founders intended to lodge decisions to wage full-blown, I'm calling full-blown war in Congress, they also probably agreed on at least one sensible exception, which is that if the United States were suddenly attacked, the president could take some military action in response to repel that invasion. I also want to say that even if what I said is right, that the founders intended to lodge exclusive power to wage war, to start war in Congress, there are a few other big questions on which the Constitution and the drafting debates don't speak clearly. To enumerate a few, one, could the president use any force unilaterally, perhaps well short of war? Two, if the United States was threatened in ways other than a direct military invasion, if its interests were threatened, if lives were threatened abroad, could the president respond militarily without waiting for Congress? And three, besides a formal declaration of war, how may Congress authorize war or force? And might that authorization be merely implicit rather than an express declaration? We're going to see that all three of those questions become big deals, some of them very quickly, very early in our history. Congress also has the power to raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a navy. This was obviously an important, relevant power here. You can't wage war without military forces to wage it. But it was also an important check on going to war because without an army, the president can't go to war. And remember that at the time of the founding, there was serious debate about whether to have a standing army at all, or at least whether to have a significant one. We're going to come back to this point later on because I think this is a check that was a big one at the time of the founding, but that largely disappears over time. And I'll show where I think it especially disappears. Turning to Article 2 about the presidency, here's where the president's war powers are. The executive power shall be vested in the president shall be commander-in-chief, and the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Now, there's a big question whether this language means that the president has actual power to initiate military conflict or to launch military interventions on his own initiative. That's certainly not clear from the text. I'm pretty dubious that this originally meant to give the president a power to launch unilaterally at least major military operations or anything approaching a full-scale war. But as I mentioned above, there are some questions that this leaves out. Can the president use force in self-defense? Can he use any force well short of war? These are some questions that I'll show you start to get filled in with practice. And so turning to practice, I think a great place to start is the neutrality crisis of 1793. This is a fun one. It's the first big foreign policy crisis of the new republic. And it's not really about declaring war at all. It's about the opposite of declaring not war. So the story goes like this, that in 1793, France was in a state of violent upheaval as revolutionaries formed a republic. They chopped off the king's head and they went to war against most of the powerful European kingdoms, including Britain. The new French government then seeks to enlist the support of the new United States in accordance with treaties dating back to the Revolutionary War when France had come to Americans' aid. And so France now expects the United States, Americans, to return that favor. And in particular, France wants American help in its maritime offensive against British commerce. Now, the Washington administration is in a bind here, because taking sides in a European war without yet adequate means to defend itself might mean getting crushed. Neutrality is also, by the way, very profitable for Americans who are able to export and carry goods to both sides in that conflict. So not only are the stakes immense, but Washington his administration has to act quickly, because France's new and pretty suave diplomat in the United States is moving ahead quickly to try to recruit sympathetic Americans to aid France in its war effort. So the main constitutional question was whether the president had the power to declare the United States neutral. And the Constitution, as I said before, gives Congress the power to declare war, but as I also said, this is the opposite, declaring not war, neutrality. So could the president use perhaps his executive power to declare American neutrality, as well as take some steps to enforce it? Or did Congress's power to declare war imply also an exclusive power to determine the country's status as war or peace? And after consulting with his cabinet, Washington acts. There's a great scene of this in the musical Hamilton, if any of you watch it. And in April 1793, Washington issues the so-called Neutrality Proclamation. Besides establishing some practice interpreting the president's executive powers pretty expansively to include things like diplomatic posturing, Washington's action here gives rise to one of the most, in my view, exquisite essays ever written about the Constitution and foreign policy, drafted and published by Alexander Hamilton under the pseudonym Pacificus. The main thrust of his essay was this idea of concurrent powers, that although the power to declare war might belong exclusively to Congress, powers to shape foreign policy are shared among the political branches and overlapping. Now, Secretary of State Jefferson, concerned by the sweeping breadth of Hamilton's conclusion, urges a very reluctant James Madison, to pen a rebuttal. And Madison does under his own alias, Helvidius. This results in this dueling set of essays by two of the most brilliant founders only a few years after the Constitution is ratified. Now, tucked into one of Hamilton's essay is a line that I think is important to unlocking a lot of what I'm going to talk about later on. Hamilton writes that the legislature is free to perform its own duties according to its own sense of them, though the executive, in the exercise of its constitutional powers, may establish an antecedent state of things which ought to weigh in the legislative decisions. I'm going to come back again and again to this idea that the president can use his powers to create an antecedent state of things that is going to at least strongly influence any room for maneuver that Congress might have. And I think, you know, the key idea here is that the president may not formally disable Congress's prerogatives to declare war, but he can certainly take some actions that have the practical effect of pushing Congress one way or the other. The next big episode I want to talk about is the so-called quasi-war. This is a conflict with France this time. In the John Adams administration, the United States does get dragged into a European war between Britain and France, and French privateers begin raiding American ships, especially in the Caribbean, where so much American commerce is transiting. And the resulting quasi-war, roughly 1798 to 1800, involves few actual battles, all of them at sea, but it does set some significant constitutional precedents. Many big constitutional questions are involved here. I want to just focus on two of them in this lecture. First, assuming the president can't start a war unilaterally, what if he takes actions that make war more likely? In this case, Adams, for example, allows the arming of American merchant vessels. Critics say this is an escalatory act. This is going to cause France to react and cause a war. Adams would say this is just defensive action. Very, very hard to draw lines here. And in any case, I think this is a great example of what Hamilton said of the president establishing a certain antecedent state of things. The broader point here, though, is that wars don't just start out of the blue. Wars tend to they result from a series of moves and counter moves between the United States and other parties. And if you focus just on the decision to formally move from peace to war, I think you miss a lot of power that both branches wield prior to that point that make a conflict more or less likely. The quasi-war also firmly established my second point here, the idea that while Congress can decide to declare all-out war, it can also authorize military measures short of that, that instead of just a formal war declaration, negotiations, for example, between Adams and Congress produced in this case a set of gradually escalating military authorizations. They authorized some specific military actions, they raised the National Army and the Navy, mobilized militias, commissioned privateers. The key idea, though, is that Congress can authorize limited war, not just a binary choice between baseline state of peace and all-out war.
Matt, can I interrupt real quick to say that, famously, there's not a ton of Supreme Court precedent or case law on these questions you're talking about, but quasi-war actually gives us some of the earliest Supreme Court statements on these sorts of questions. Can you focus on that for a second and shed light?
Yeah, absolutely. One reason why this is a difficult area of law and why I say a lot of law is set in this area, more by patterns of practice among the political branches, is because there's very little judicial precedent on these questions of war initiation or the power to initiate force. You're also right that it's the quasi-war that produces some of the most interesting and important Supreme Court cases. One that you may have in mind here is a case called Boss v. Tingy. This one grew out of the capture and sale of a ship. There's a 1799 statute that grants a generous reward for recapturing American vessels from, quote, enemy privateers, raising the question, well, without having declared war, was France an enemy? And in holding yes, the Supreme Court validated the idea, this important idea that Congress can authorize limited force short of declaring all-out war. And Justice Samuel Chase has this great line in his concurring opinion where he says that Congress is empowered to declare a general war, or Congress may wage a limited war, limited in place, in objects, and in time. And I think there's a big important principle here, which is that Congress need not simply choose whether to switch, flip a binary switch, peace or all-out war. It could sort of turn up or down dials of armed conflict, authorizing only certain types of military operations or restricting them to certain places or purposes. I'll come back to that point actually in lecture 3, because there's then a very difficult issue of when does Congress's effort to tune those dials bump up against the president's discretion, constitutional powers and discretion as commander-in-chief. But yes, you're right. Very few Supreme Court cases in this area, some important ones arising out of the quasi-war. I'll jump next to the War of 1812. The complex war, the causes include British impressment of Americans into the British Navy, essentially kidnapping, British support for Native American Indians that were hostile to the United States, and also British trade restrictions against American trade. The War of 1812 is often celebrated since and to this day as a victory. I think it's really a tie. It's almost a catastrophic defeat. But for our purposes in this lecture, one of the things that's interesting is that it's our first formally declared war against a major European power. So it's a good opportunity to test, well, how well did that declare war clause work? And you know, the declare war clause is often idealized. I think it's intended to operate in a few ways. It's intended, at least the founders intended it, to avoid a presidential rush to war. It's intended to provide for careful deliberation. And it's designed to ensure that any war would enjoy very broad American public support. And I think the War of 1812 is a pretty tough test for each of those propositions. In fact, I think the War of 1812 fails along each of those dimensions. You know, as to the first, it doesn't really prevent a presidential rush to war. In fact, it's war hawks in Congress who were more interested in war than the president, who was pretty reluctant. And in fact, a tragedy of this war is that it probably could have been avoided if we just waited a little longer. Just days before the United States declares war, the British government removes one of the main American grievances. It revokes decrees that had severely restricted American trade, but news didn't make it across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States in time before the United States declares war, and by then it's too late. The declaration process doesn't provide careful deliberation. We were woefully unprepared for this war. We didn't go to war with clear agreement on even what our war strategy was. And it doesn't ensure broad public support. This was the closest war declaration vote in American history. Both chambers, by the way, debated in secret. The vote was 19-13 in the Senate and 79, a little bit bigger gap, 79-49 in the House. The country was sharply split along partisan and regional lines, with Republicans in the South and West mostly supporting the war, Federalists concentrated in the Northeast opposing it, and the country nearly splits apart over this war. In the end, I'd say we're pretty lucky to walk away after fighting this one to a draw. A draw against, you know, one of the world's most powerful empires at the time, but pretty much a draw that really just brings us back around to the status quo ante. Let me talk next about, this is President Monroe, our fifth president. He doesn't really get much play in war powers lore, but I think his administration was important in a few ways. That's then General Andrew Jackson, who also features prominently at this time. And until this point, major foreign policy dangers, major security threats came from empires like Britain and France that were too militarily strong. Now a danger comes from an empire that's too weak, in particular the Spanish Empire, which is deteriorating. Its hold is starting to slip on neighboring colonies to the south, and this allows cross-border threats to grow. So Seminole Indians were, for example, raiding Georgia from sanctuaries in Spanish Florida, which the Spanish government couldn't police effectively. Spanish Florida is also a haven for runaway American slaves, for pirates who were raiding American commerce. So in 1818, General Jackson leads a force of US Army, state militia forces, volunteer forces into Spanish Florida. And in addition to raising Seminole Indian villages during a very brutal march through the territory, he also seizes Spanish forts, captures and even executes 2 British nationals who were allegedly aiding the Seminoles. And before long, the United States essentially controls most of Florida. Now, these belligerent actions, not surprisingly, set off pretty intense diplomatic protests in Spain and Britain. They also set off protests at home, including among some members of Congress and the press, who charged that Jackson's destructive campaign was not only dangerous, but unconstitutionally beyond the president's power without any congressional authorization. In a sense, the charge is that Jackson had made war against Spain unilaterally. This is an especially interesting example because it remains unknown just whether President Monroe even privately approved Jackson's actions in advance. And after a lot of tough internal deliberation, the Monroe administration defends Jackson and his campaign. And it's in its defense, we see the beginning of a real expansion of the idea of self-defense. Remember, I said it was generally understood that the president could probably respond to an invasion and repel it unilaterally, some limited self-defense powers. Now, in this case, we don't have a direct invasion by Spain. Rather, we have a failure, perhaps, by Spain to prevent threats from emanating from within its borders, and the executive branch asserting a very broad understanding of the president's self-defense powers. Now, many in Congress disagreed with that view, but they weren't able to muster a very strong response. Henry Clay, for example, the fiery Speaker of the House, argues, quote, "Of all the powers conferred by the Constitution, not one is more expressly and exclusively granted than that is to Congress of declaring war." He goes on to say, "It was to guard our country against precisely that species of rashness, which has been manifested in Florida, that the Constitution was so framed," end quote. In the end, though, Congress lacks the votes to do much about it. Resolutions in neither house, the House or the Senate, pass condemning Jackson's campaign. And I think the important general lesson here, and it's one that would repeat throughout American history, was that once a military intervention starts, it's very hard for Congress to muster a very strong response to end it or to cut it off or even to condemn it, especially if it's a politically popular one. And perhaps putting this another way, if the slow-moving institutional machinery of congressional deliberation was supposed to avoid a rush to war, once the executive branch moves on its own, those same features of Congress become a bug. And at that point, it falls to Congress to try to act decisively, say by passing resolutions condemning the action. But it's very hard for a slow-moving and a bicameral Congress to do that. In other words, the president has a first mover advantage, and then Congress often has trouble even moving second at all in response because of the way it's designed. So let me talk next about the Monroe Doctrine, which is a kind of episode that doesn't often come up in war powers discussions for a pretty simple reason. There's no war. But I think it's important to the war powers story because historically, often one of the most important ways in which the United States uses military power is not by waging war, but threatening war. Implicit threats of force always loom in the diplomatic background of American foreign policy. But as the United States slowly builds up its military power in the 19th century, threats begin to move to the foreground and sometimes become more explicit. So here is just a reminder, Monroe was declaring that if any European powers tried to establish new colonies or meddle in the Western Hemisphere, the United States would regard that as a threat to its vital interests and act accordingly. And from a constitutional standpoint, Monroe's proclamation is a great example of the president's vast constitutional power to at least communicate, if not set, US foreign policy. And this isn't just any kind of foreign policy or any kind of diplomatic statement, though. This is what we call today drawing a red line with an implicit war threat. Without taking any military action, this is an example of what Hamilton was talking about, establishing an antecedent state of things.
Hey, Matt, let me ask a pair of questions about that. So first of all, is it clear from the record whether Monroe actually thought he had unilateral authority to act militarily, that is without congressional authorization, if a European power crossed his red line? And then related to that, did the United States actually have the ability to project military power realistically as a practical matter in that case?
Yeah, those are great questions. And the short answer to both is no. And that's part of the, I think, the sort of some, we might say, sort of brilliant audacity of the Monroe Doctrine was, first of all, President Monroe was basically issuing an implicit war threat, but his administration did not think he had the legal authority to back up that threat if any of the European powers called his bluff. In fact, we have the record of some new states in Latin America basically asking American diplomats, hey, if a European power crosses this line, can the president do anything about it? And the answer was sort of a quiet, actually, no, only Congress can make a decision to actually go to war. You're also right that even if Congress wanted to declare war, the United States didn't have, at least at the ready, military power to back up this threat. I think the part of the brilliance of it was that the Monroe administration did this in a way where they knew that the British, who sort of shared our interest, would probably enforce the red line if we weren't able to. So the U.S. definitely did not have the power to back up this threat, which is interesting because I think it's really the first very, very big and sort of, I think it's the first very, very big red line that that the United States draws, and it's one that becomes even more important in the over the course of the next century, really. Let me turn next to the Mexican-American War. This is one that does feature in a big way in kind of war powers lore. The Mexican-American War is known mostly in constitutional law as important for how the war started. But I've argued in an essay for Lawfare, I don't think actually that the way it started is the most important or the most interesting aspect from a constitutional standpoint. I'll talk about some of the other issues in the next lecture, but here I will talk about how it starts. So the story is roughly like this. In 1846, Congress declares war for the second time in U.S. history. The United States had the previous year annexed Texas, which had recently seceded from Mexico. Tensions between the United States and Mexico had been running high over Texas, and that included a dispute about its southern border. So the United States and Mexico disagree about where that border is. Mexico claims that it's at it starts at the Nueces River. The United States claims that it's marked by the Rio Grande. There's quite a lot of territory that's at stake here, and the belligerent and quite xenophobic Polk had long been pressing for war, viewing the acquisition of Mexico's northern territories, this sort of whole area out here that I'll get to in a moment, as an integral part of America's manifest destiny. And when Polk's overtures to buy Mexico's northern provinces were rebuffed, so this is the disputed border area. Polk sends General Zachary Taylor and a few thousand soldiers into that disputed border zone between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, which the two sides respectively regard as the proper line. This, again, predictably, provokes a Mexican response, in this case, to attack Taylor's forces. Once again, I think using Hamilton's words, the president is using his commander-in-chief powers here to move troops around, to do so in a way that establishes an antecedent state of things. So when Mexican troops kill some American soldiers patrolling that area, Polk quickly seizes upon it, urges Congress to declare war, claiming that Mexico had essentially invaded and shed American blood on American soil. Congress's power over the war declaration, I think, again, fails to serve as a brake on a rush to war, as the founders might have hoped. Polk's allies rush his proposed war resolution through the chambers of Congress with very little information or debate. Basically, Polk wanted war, and he got it. Now, ultimately, the United States wins and wrests, as I suggest here, a lot of territory from Mexico. I'm going to talk about this map in lecture 3. The United States, through a treaty ending the war, acquires Mexico's vast northern provinces and greatly enlarges the territory of the United States. These end up becoming basically the entire American Southwest. Now, in the end, the House of Representatives, passes a resolution calling the war unnecessarily and unconstitutionally begun, but it's non-binding. And by then, the United States has already won the war. Polk has achieved his war aims. I think a recurring lesson here is that even if Congress holds formally the reins for declaring war, there's a lot that the president can do, taking unilateral diplomatic or military actions that make war more or less likely. And another important lesson here is that Congress often depends very heavily on the president for information in its deliberations about war. In this case, Congress's rapid decision was based entirely on a pretty shady recitation of facts by Polk. Congress often relies, even to this day, on intelligence, on information that's provided for the executive branch. So even if Congress retains formal control over decisions to go to war, this gives the president a very significant advantage that he can wield. In the 1830s through really the 50s especially, presidents launch many isolated military actions in distant spots around Latin America, Asia, Africa. These included US naval strikes or amphibious landings in places like Argentina's Falkland Islands, Sumatra, Fiji, China, places along the West African coast, many, many others. The executive branch took almost all of these, not all, but many of them without explicit congressional authorization. And together they therefore sort of form let's say a body of practice that some lawyers, especially executive branch lawyers, continue to cite to this day for the proposition that the president enjoys very broad authority to intervene abroad to protect American interests. As to constitutional limits, as far as I know, no administration during this period thought that the president had unilateral authority to initiate war, full war with another state. No president thought that. I think constitutional law was still clear on that point. Constitutional law was murky, though, on the scope of the president's power to use limited force especially against people or governments that were not recognized among, let's call it, the club of civilized states, as they might have been called at the time. Today we might call them non-state actors, included pirates or quote, savages. Besides falling outside the coverage of international protections reserved for states at that time, these non-state actors or weaker governments couldn't really, they didn't have the capacity to fight a major war against the United States. So in general, presidents held the view that they had constitutional power, even without any specific legislative approval, to take some small-scale military action, especially against non-state actors, to protect, let's say, American lives, American property, and other interests. Congress, meanwhile, generally went along with this with varying levels of acceptance or reluctance, though sometimes conducting a form of oversight or investigations into events and sometimes raising alarm about them. The picture here is from an incident in Greytown, now present-day Nicaragua, in 1854, and it's an interesting story legally because it gives rise to a judicial case. After violence against American diplomats and property by locals who had taken control of the town, which was itself an important transit point, a U.S. naval commander was sent to deal with the situation. And he warns local authorities that they have 24 hours to provide an adequate apology and compensation for damage and insults. And when that warning goes unheeded, the commander opens fire on the town. He sends a landing party of Marines that burn it to the ground. And because American property is destroyed, though, it results in a federal lawsuit giving rise to a decision. It's a lower court decision, not a Supreme Court decision, upholding the constitutionality of executive branch action here without congressional authorization. This was a small action relative to, it was not a war. It was a sort of a one-off isolated incident against, again, what today we would probably describe as a non-state actor. But sometimes this judicial decision is cited for a much broader proposition that the president has vast power to defend American interests abroad, including using military force.
Hey, Matt. So there's an interesting practical question here. And can you talk a little bit about that? That is it even practical in these sorts of situations? If the president thought he was supposed to go to Congress, how would that actually work as a practical matter?
Yeah, I think in short, no. And I think there are some practical reasons having to do with technology at the time, why it would have been very difficult to engage in these kinds of military actions with congressional authorization. Essentially, word traveled slowly at the time. It traveled by sea, mostly. This meant that the president could dispatch naval forces, naval squadrons, only with a lot of uncertainty about what the current state of diplomatic relations would be thousands of miles away. And once he sent them, he had very limited ability to oversee their conduct or to recall those forces. It could take months, at least weeks, often months, for information to travel each way between Washington and naval units that were patrolling distant waters. So if kind of timely and decisive military action were deemed sometimes necessary to deal with these problems, it would have been pretty impractical to try to coordinate naval actions closely with the administration in Washington, let alone to go to Congress and seek congressional authorization for each individual use of force. So instead, naval commanders were usually given written instructions that were, the balance was to be struck between writing them these instructions specific enough to avoid strategic pitfalls and avoid crossing constitutional lines, but also broad enough to give commanders a lot of discretion to deal with situations as they saw fit. And sometimes Congress would exercise a form of oversight by demanding to see these instructions, to scrutinize what exactly were commanders instructed to do and under what circumstances. There were a few instances of congressional pre-authorization of these sort of limited discrete uses of force. Those were rare. And there was even a sort of a constitutional argument that would rear its head that it was perhaps a sort of unconstitutional delegation of power to authorize the president to use force in advance of even knowing what the situation was going to be. In the end, the president uses force oftentimes unilaterally in many of these small situations. We're going to see later, though, that the presidents use this set of small uses of force in order to justify some very, very big ones. Let me turn to the Civil War. This is Fort Sumter being attacked in April of 1861, really marking the beginning of the Civil War. Lincoln Congress is out of session, and Lincoln doesn't call it back into emergency session until July 4th of 1861. So in between, in those 3 months in between, Lincoln engages in a lot of unilateral action, which Congress ultimately blesses. A big question, though, is whether the president could take military action against the Confederacy in the interim at all. And that included a lot of things that the president claimed were legal by virtue of a state of war, even though Congress had not declared it or authorized it, including things like Lincoln's order to blockade Confederate ports. And that blockade gives rise to a set of cases called the prize cases. They're called that because they involve vessels that were attempting to run the blockade of Confederate ports and that were captured and sold as prizes. And one of the legal issues at stake was whether the blockade was legal. Well, whether the blockade was legal depended on whether the war was legal, and that depended on whether the president could wage war unilaterally. The president wins that case very narrowly in a decision written by Justice Greer, who's pictured here. It's a complicated case. I want to just focus on one line from it. This is one of the most often quoted lines in sort of war powers jurisprudence and brief writing. It says, if a war be made by invasion of the United States by a foreign nation, the president is not only authorized but bound to resist force by force. Now, remember, I said that this was probably understood implicitly by the framers, that if the United States is invaded, the president does have some unilateral power to repel an invasion. One reason why this is so significant, why I pause on this, is because, as Bobby and I were talking about earlier, judicial opinions, especially Supreme Court ones, on big issues of war powers like the power to make war are very rare. And so this line gets quoted in the modern era by the executive branch a lot. And what you'll see, though, if you read executive branch lawyering on the president's power to use force, is often this quote gets clipped like this. Just this part gets quoted. The president is not only authorized, but bound to resist force by force, right? They excise out the whole part about it being an invasion by a foreign nation. That's a pretty big caveat that often gets edited out in what's probably dictum anyway. But the Civil War is filled with interesting war powers issues, and the prize cases is just one of them. It's especially significant, though, like I said, because it produces a Supreme Court opinion, and it's one that gets quoted very, very often and interpreted very, very broadly. So following the Civil War, I'm going to move really quickly now through a bunch of history. We go through a long period in which the focus is mostly inward in the United States. As we get to the 20th century, the United States engages in some overseas imperialism, including the Spanish-American War, a world war, the first one, another world war, and then in between those wars, also a period of intense non-interventionism, or sometimes mislabeled isolationism. We've got three major wars, by the way, that I've just burned through quickly here. That were all declared: the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. I'm not going to spend much time on those, other than to just make a few notes here. First, the Spanish-American War, like I said, all three of those were declared. Spanish-American War is another one where I think the war declaration process hardly works anywhere near the way that it's idealized. This was a war that was not thought through. And in the rush to war, there was inadequate attention to readiness, inadequate attention to war aims. In fact, we don't even know, by the way, the vote count for that congressional war declaration because Congress did it by a voice vote. So I don't think that's a very good, certainly a good case validating the way the declare war process is often, like I say, sort of idealized. World War I stands out to me by contrast as one in which I think the declare war process, it actually worked pretty well, right? The United States stayed out of the war for a while. It debated over several years whether or not to get into the war. It tried a bunch of things short of war. And eventually things got to a point where the president said, enough is enough. I'm going to Congress. I'm going to seek a war declaration, and he got it. So that's war declaration process kind of works pretty well as measured against the way it's supposed to work there. World War II was an easy case for war declaration because we were attacked. And then when we declared war against Japan, Germany declared war against us. So that was kind of a slam dunk case for declaring war.
Matt, let me bring us back real quick
Yeah.
to World War I. So there were some who didn't see it as the declare war process as working so well as you just described. What was the line of argument we heard that from those who felt that actually the process was problematic in some way?
Yeah, that's fair. Not everybody thought that the process worked well, and the way I'd put it this way is because it's an interesting story about efforts to perhaps even amend the Constitution and make it harder to declare war. So, in the modern debate today, I'd say one end of the debate takes the position that lodging decisions to use force in Congress, certainly war decisions in Congress, best constrains sort of military adventurism and ensures public deliberation. That requiring congressional declaration or authorization for war is basically seen as the gold standard for going to war. After World War I, though, many Americans thought that even that original scheme of vesting war-making decisions in Congress was too permissive, too detached from popular will. And they thought basically the constitutional framework had failed us in World War I and brought us unnecessarily into a foreign war. And so members of that movement thought that a jingoistic press and arms industry had basically pressured the government into war. So there was actually a pretty strong movement to amend the Constitution to add a step, to add an additional check, a public referendum before Congress could declare war. So you'd need a public referendum and a congressional war declaration before the United States would go to war. This was, I think, just a terrible idea. The FDR administration also thought it was a terrible idea. It did have pretty big public support. Eventually, the FDR administration lobbies against it, and it's killed. It doesn't go anywhere. But it does have some steam behind it. It's also, I think, a useful reminder that since the Bill of Rights, which say little bits here and there about military power, but really since the founding, no constitutional amendments are directly related to war, even though war, American military power, and American grand strategy have all changed radically. We're still operating under the same constitutional text when it comes to war powers than the nation was born with. So let me sort of pause now and take stock of where we are at this point. So at this point, by 1945, Congress has declared war in the 5 largest conflicts. It never formally declares war again. World War II is the last war that Congress officially declares. It authorizes others, but it doesn't declare war. And the war declaration process, I think, has shown some severe limitations. I'm not going to say that it doesn't have any constraint, it doesn't restrain at all, but I think we need to be realistic about what it does and doesn't do effectively. The executive branch has asserted growing power to use military force, and Congress and courts have failed to push back. That's not to say that the executive branch is totally free to act. I think even without formal action by Congress and courts, Congress, and this is a point I'll get to later, Congress exerts a lot of political checks on the president, but the president is continuing throughout this period to assert growing power to use military force, and then finally, even without actually initiating hostilities, the president wields vast powers that could affect the probability of war up or down. And this brings us next to the Korean War. This was the largest and still is the largest foreign war fought without an express congressional war declaration or express authorization. It begins in June 1950 when North Korean forces pour across the 38th parallel into pro-Western South Korea. The invasion is the first big military action of the Cold War, and the president quickly goes to the UN for authorization. He sends supplies, then air and naval support, and then finally ground troops, and this results in a 3-year conflict in which tens of thousands of US troops are killed. I think a reason why it's important is not just that the president acted without congressional authorization, but that the executive branch lays out a very detailed argument as to why the president has the power to do so. And I think that argument has a few major features that have become, ever since then, really part of the executive branch legal justifications for other unilateral uses of force. First, the executive branch argues and publishes memos explaining this is not war. The phrase that's used is a police action. But I think a way to think about this is the executive branch is adopting a radically broad understanding of self-defense, that self-defense is not just about attacks directly against US territory, but the president also now has the power to defend against systemic risks to the international system, including international stability, the international legal system, later attacks on allies. There were elements of this kind of legal justification in some previous interventions, but the Korea memo takes them to a whole new level based on a very broad understanding of the president's military and foreign relations powers. The president also here details, or the executive branch details, a historical argument, arguing that the president has often acted unilaterally, quote, to prevent violent and unlawful acts in other states from depriving the United States and its nationals of the benefits of such peace and security. It publishes a very long list, though including some of the small uses of force that I referred to earlier, and none of the examples that the executive branch cites are anywhere near the size of the US intervention in Korea. But this case becomes an important marker, an important precedent, and certainly the argument by the Truman administration becomes a template. And let me though note, although there is no express congressional authorization at the front end of this conflict, at the beginning of this conflict, it is not entirely unilateral in that there are a lot of congressional consultations early on. And as the war goes on, Truman goes to Congress for legislative support, and Congress passes acts that at least implicitly support the war effort, like providing funding for the war, extending the draft. So it's important to note also that many influential members of Congress didn't think that express authorization was needed at the front end. Congress wasn't, at least not initially, clamoring for the president to come to Congress for authorization here.
Sina, you know that a lot of people in talking about war powers in history will cite the Korean War as the watershed
Yeah.
moment where presidential power, whatever it was before, suddenly blossoms into its modern form, and that this was transformational. Is this right? I mean, is that a fair characterization?
So, sort of. I'd put it this way. I'd say that Korea is very important, but its significance is sometimes, often, I'd say, overstated. And I do think that there are a few important caveats that are in order here. First, at the moment of intervention, when Truman is deciding whether or not to get congressional authorization and he decides not to, it wasn't expected at that time that this was going to be a 3-year war with tens of thousands of Americans killed. It's a much bigger conflict in hindsight than was expected at the moment. It's also important to keep in mind that at that time, in 1950, the point of reference for what a war is were like the world wars, possible war with the Soviet Union. So compared to those, if that's the baseline, intervention to prop up South Korea and push back North Korean forces, it may have seemed small compared to the world, at least compared to the world wars. So that's point number one. Point number two is sometimes I think the emphasis on the Korean War in the story of the growth of growth of presidential unilateral power obscures just how much power previous presidents had asserted in using force and the degree to which checks on unilateral presidential moves that were envisioned at the founding had already started to erode. And I hope the lecture so far has helped to show that. Now, this is not to say the Korean War wasn't important. It took things up another big step. But the story of American presidential unilateralism does not start with Korea. I'd also make a point that since Korea, we haven't really had a repeat. Even when presidents have asserted the power to start big wars unilaterally since then, they've gone to Congress. Vietnam is complicated. I'll talk about that in a moment, but we have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to support it. Both Iraq wars were authorized by Congress. The war in Afghanistan, or the global war against Al-Qaeda, authorized by Congress. So legally, Korea produced precedent and a roadmap of future legal argumentation that I think is very important. Politically, though, I think the lesson even learned by the Truman administration was that going to major war without congressional authorization is a bad idea, and so we haven't seen it done since. So yes, Korea, very important, but with some important caveats. As I mentioned, Korea is sort of the first big action of the Cold War. We continue to see an expansion of presidential power to initiate force in the Cold War. And I think that's due to a few factors. One, really high stakes and global American interests. The US regards events around the world now as important to American security. So security crises anywhere around the world are sort of viewed as though they're tantamount to attacks on the United States. A massive peacetime military. Let me explain this. Let me start by blowing up this figure a little bit. Up until this point, this is where I want to come back to that clause in Article 1 that says Congress has the power to create an army and a navy. Up until this point, the basic pattern of American military power looked like this. We had very small standing military forces in peacetime. Then when we get to a war, we'd mobilize and build an army. And as soon as that war was over, we would demobilize it. So these spikes you see here refer to, this is the War of 1812. This is at scale, so it's a tiny spike, but a little bump. The War of 1812, then you go back to pretty much nothing. Mexican-American War, get another little bump, get a spike here for the Civil War, get another little bump here for the Spanish-American War. World War I, big army, demobilized almost immediately. Big army for World War II, quick demobilization, but then demobilization with the onset of the Cold War stops. And from this period of the early Cold War on, the president always has at his disposal massive military forces. So up until that time, an important structural check on the president's ability to go to war unilaterally was he didn't have an army to do it with unless he got one from Congress. That changes in the early Cold War, where for that time on, the president at all times and ever since then has a lot of military power at his disposal. This is just a similar graphic, but displayed differently. This is defense spending as a percentage of GDP. You see basically the same pattern. One big form of military power the president has at all times, nuclear weapons. The advent of nuclear weapons could theoretically have cut against presidential powers on the grounds that, now more than ever we need strong checks on force on war. If any war could escalate to go nuclear. On balance, I would say, though, that the speed and destructiveness of nuclear weapons was generally seen as an argument for giving presidents greater leeway to use force. And then finally, alliances. After World War II, the United States overturned the dogma going back to the founding that was an aversion of entangling alliances. Now the United States was embracing alliances, NATO alliances with countries in East Asia, for example. This led to the United States now stationing troops abroad, and also to arguments that we needed to maintain the credibility of alliances and act quickly to uphold them. And these arguments, again, generally favored the president.
Hey, Matt, I want to ask how this intersects with NATO and the North Atlantic Treaty. Did this issue of the president's powers relating to the initiation of war, did this complicate the Senate's decision in support of the NATO treaty?
Yeah, definitely. This was a big issue in the Senate's process of advising and consenting on the North Atlantic Treaty. Basically, the argument was that if the United States committed to a treaty, committed to in advance to coming to the military aid of allies, that this would in effect, and this was a concern that some senators raised, this would in effect delegate Congress's control over declaring war. The United States would be pre-committing to going to war and therefore neutralizing Congress's control over that decision. So this was a big issue in the ratification debates. I'd say it basically gets papered over. What happens is negotiators end up inserting language into the North Atlantic Treaty. This language gets basically cut and pasted into other defense treaties that say that American defense commitments, or all parties' defense commitments, will be carried out, quote, in accordance with their respective constitutional processes, end quote. So this was basically a way of saying nothing in this treaty vitiates existing constitutional arrangements. In practice, I think these treaties did result in, or did strengthen, the president's hand, but the executive branch kind of papered over that issue at the time the treaties were ratified and said, no, nothing, sort of nothing to see here on presidential powers. I'll just say a brief word about covert war. And I'm going to be brief because Bobby did an entire lecture on covert action as part of this series. So I'll refer you here to that lecture. Just as a quick reminder, covert action means operations to influence military, political, and economic conditions abroad, where it's intended that the hand of the US government will be hidden. And especially during the Cold War, the US engages in a bunch of covert actions that are a lot like wars. This includes arming rebels against communist governments. Among the most famous are the badly failed Bay of Pigs in Cuba, aiding Nicaraguan rebels, aiding rebels in Afghanistan to combat the Soviets. Eventually, Congress imposes some procedural restrictions, which Bobby talks about in his lecture on covert action. But these covert actions, even the ones that are essentially proxy wars, don't require any express congressional authorization. And I think this is an important part of the war power story, because this becomes another way in which the president is, in effect, exercising war powers, exercising the power to wield violence in defense of American interests. Let me turn now to Vietnam. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy. It's a complex a conflict. I'll just talk about a few aspects of it here. Initially, our involvement in Vietnam starts by sending advisors to assist South Vietnam against communist-backed North Vietnamese rebels, as well as the North Vietnamese forces. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution occurs in 1964. Allegations there that turn out to be false are that North Vietnamese vessels have attacked US naval vessels. And this in turn leads the Johnson administration to go to Congress and obtain the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which contains extremely broad language authorizing force. It says not just that, quote, the president may take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression, end quote here. But it also goes on to say, quote, the United States is therefore prepared, as the president determines, to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, to assist any member or protocol state of the Southeast Asia Collective Defense Treaty requesting assistance in defense of its freedom, end quote. So a very, very broad force authorization here. I'd also just note that while the Johnson administration obtains this very broad congressional authorization, it argues that it doesn't need it. It takes a sort of belt and suspenders approach, argues this was just extra congressional blessing, but essentially extending the Korean War logic. The executive branch argued defense of American interests, defense of allies. These are things that the president has the power to do. Essentially making the argument that whereas in 1789, the president had power to defend the territorial boundaries of the United States, now our defensive perimeter is pushed way out there, bumping up against the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, extending its influence globally. And so the president's power to engage in military operations unilaterally also ought to extend as well. I'll also just mention, in addition to very rapid escalation in the intensity of this war, what's also interesting about the Vietnam War is that it expands horizontally. The president argues and acts not just in South Vietnam, North Vietnam, but expands the war into neighboring Laos and Cambodia. essentially on the grounds that, well, first of all, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was extremely broad, but in a sense arguing that these were discretionary actions that the executive branch, that the president as commander-in-chief could take. North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese rebels were moving materiel and forces through Laos and Cambodia, and in order to neutralize them, it was the president's prerogative to take military action across those borders. In the next lecture, I'll talk a bit about the important role that Congress eventually plays in overseeing this war and ending it. That's in lecture 3, though that's really not until public opinion turns very significantly against this war. There's a lot more going on here than you'd know, though, if you just focus on statutes and resolutions that Congress successfully passes. This is, though, a very costly and tragic war. So at the end of it, we have in 1973 a moment of presidential weakness and congressional resurgence. And that results in the 1973 War Powers Resolution. In fact, enough weakness in the presidency and strength asserted by Congress in foreign and defense policy that the War Powers Resolution is passed over Nixon's veto after he charged that it would undermine U.S. national security. So let me just read a few of the provisions. You see the purpose there is, according to Congress, to return to the original intent of the framers, that Congress ought to control the reins of decisions to go to war or not. The War Powers Resolution also contains a notification requirement. In a timely way, the president is required to notify Congress of the introduction of forces into hostilities or imminent hostilities. This is to try to promote interbranch dialogue and collaboration. And importantly, it contains a 60-day, or in some emergency circumstances, a 90-day time limit, after which, unless Congress authorizes continued operations, the president is required to withdraw those military forces. Let me just also mention something that's not on this slide. Congress was originally also able to, under the War Powers Resolution, require the president to withdraw forces immediately by passing what's called a concurrent resolution, meaning a resolution by both houses of Congress that doesn't require presidential signature, so doesn't allow for a presidential veto. That provision is regarded as unconstitutional because of an unrelated Supreme Court case called INS v. Chadha, holding that Congress can't use those kinds of what are called legislative vetoes. So that means that rather than just a bare majority of Congress needing being able to require the president to withdraw forces, now you'd need presumably a veto-proof majority on the assumption that if Congress demanded the president pull back forces, the president probably would veto it. I think the War Powers Resolution has become, shown here, pretty blurry. The executive branch has interpreted it flexibly. Congress hasn't really enforced it, in part because, as I said up front, Congress often doesn't have I think, the political will or the political incentives to stick its neck out and enforce it. And neither have courts stepped in to enforce the terms of the War Powers Resolution, at least not yet. I'll give some examples of that in a moment. I think for all these reasons, the War Powers Resolution is seen largely as a failure. I think that's partially overstated. I think the War Powers Resolution has definitely been watered down. It doesn't act as let's say, a hard constraint, but it still weighs very heavily, I think, in executive branch decision making. It still raises the political costs to get failing to get congressional authorization and intervening beyond 60 days. So sort of to bring us up mostly to the present, let me talk about the case study of Libya and the intervention in 2011. So there, the United States engages in some months-long military operations in Libya as part of an international coalition authorized by the UN Security Council in response to Libyan leader Gaddafi's brutal repression and threat of atrocities during an uprising, a civil war in Libya. Ultimately, US and coalition operations contribute to the overthrow of the Libyan government. So why is this interesting? What does it show us about war powers today? First of all, this was an example of an intervention that, as is pretty typical, was not specifically or expressly authorized by Congress. Second, if you read the justification, the executive branch's argument is that this was in the national interest, and the military operations were limited in nature, scope, and duration such that they didn't rise to the level of war with a capital W. They didn't rise to the level of the kind of big war for which maybe the president would have to go to Congress for express authorization. The Libya memo by the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department lays all this out. It draws heavily on some previous Justice Department opinions in some similar interventions in the 90s in places like Haiti, Somalia, Bosnia. This intervention extends beyond 60 days. So how does the executive branch get around the 60-day limit, the requirement that after 60 days, the president is supposed to withdraw forces? Well, the executive branch argues that US operations here weren't, quote, hostilities. That's the trigger in the War Powers Resolution, essentially arguing that hostilities is a very high bar. These were sufficiently low-level military operations that they didn't trigger that 60-day withdrawal requirement. And I'll just end this slide by noting none of these issues are likely justiciable. The best case to read on courts' reluctance to weigh into these kinds of debates is a case arising in the 1999 Kosovo intervention, a case called Campbell v. Clinton. And you'll see that, you know, in that and other cases, courts have all kinds of doctrines for punting on these issues. They can call these non-justiciable political questions. They can say that nobody has standing to raise these concerns. They can dismiss cases on ripeness or on mootness. Bunch of different doctrinal options, but in the end, courts tend not to decide these kinds of issues. So what are some emergent issues or some big things to pay attention to going forward? I'll run through just a few quickly. One is there's a lot of attention these days to so-called forever wars and the 2001 AUMF. 19 years ago, after the 9/11 attack, Congress passes a resolution authorizing the president to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the September 11th attack. That's been used since then as the basis for operations in many places, including Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Syria. And I think a big lesson there is that once passed, authorizations to use force are very hard to revoke or even amend. Next point I'll just make is there have been some recent efforts to try to hem in the president. Persian Gulf partners have been engaged in a brutal war in Yemen. Congress last year passed a resolution to end American support for it. There was also concern about unilateral presidential action against Iran after Trump's strikes on Iranian General Soleimani. This led Congress to pass a resolution requiring congressional approval, but before taking military action against Iran. Both of those actions were vetoed by the president. Again, the challenge here is, how do you pass something over the president's veto? That's immensely difficult. I do think, though, that that doesn't give you the full story, because I think even if these kinds of resolutions are vetoed, they raise the political price to presidents for acting unilaterally or to taking military action, and they therefore represent some important political constraints that Congress can wield. Finally, on cyber operations and cyber conflict, some worried that this is yet another means of unilateral war making. I think this problem is overstated. First, it's not so clear that cyber attacks should even be thought of as military attacks at all, especially if we're concerned about putting American troops in harm's way, because cyber attacks don't involve American troops, at least not in direct line of fire. And also, this is an area in which Congress has actually expressly delegated a lot of authority to the executive branch, and sometimes pushed the executive branch to be more aggressive in cyberspace. I'd especially refer you to Bobby's writing about these issues in Lawfare. So I'll just end with a few key takeaways. First, this is a story, as I said, a story about growth in presidential power, but it's a story that's an incremental growth and one that starts at the very beginning. It's a story in which all three branches are responsible. Yes, the executive branch has worked to aggrandize itself, but the other branches have been complicit. So what, though? Is this really a crisis? I do think we've moved very far from the original constitutional design. And in some cases, there are some good reasons for that. But I also think that political checks do a lot of work here in restraining presidential military action. And I think if we only look at formal approval by Congress, you miss a lot of Congress's most important ways of influencing military action. I actually think some of the more urgent issues are not about sort of reconstituting Congress's control over the decisions to go to war, but about improving Congress's management and oversight about how wars are waged. And that's the topic of the next lecture. So with that, thank you very much, Bobby.
Outstanding, Matt.